Iran during World War. Suppression of the Iranian Revolution (OF) 1905 to 1911 contributed to the further enslavement of Iran and the strengthening of the economic and political positions of England and Tsarist Russia in the country. On the eve of the First World War, Iran almost completely turned into a colony of England and Tsarist Russia, and only formally continued to be considered an independent state. In his work, Imperialism, as the Highest Stage of Capitalism, V.I., Lenin wrote about Persia, China and Turkey as semi-colonies. And he pointed out that the first of these countries has almost completely become a colony, the second and third are becoming such. Back in February 1912, under pressure from England and Tsarist Russia, the Iranian government was forced to officially recognize the Anglo-Russian Agreement of 1907 on the division of Iran into spheres of influence. Iran's financial enslavement has intensified. Between 1911 and 1914, the Shah's government received 5 new loans and advances, 3 of them in England, totaling £2 million. And 2 in Russia for about 14 million rubles. Gold. In 1914, Iran owed England and Russia £6,804,000. Iran had to pay £563,600 of interest alone on loans annually, which accounted for between 1/4 and 1/3 of all Iranian government spending. The influence of the English Shahanshah and Russian accounting and loan banks increased even more. The process of turning Iran into an agricultural appendage of the capitalist states intensified. Before the First World War, the British began to widely develop the exploitation of South Iranian oil in Khuzestan. In 1908, rich oil reserves were discovered in the Masjid Solomon area. In 1909, the Anglo-Persian Oil Company was organized. In 1935, it was renamed the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. In connection with the growth of the industrial and military importance of oil and the transfer of the English Navy to oil fuel, the British government bought up a controlling stake in the company and thus established its control over its activities. The importance of Iranian oil especially increased during the First World War, when, under an agreement with the British Admiralty, the company supplied oil to the British Navy. During the war, oil production at the company's enterprises increased from 80,000 tons in 1913 to 1,100,000 tons in 1919. In connection with the organization of the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, the enslavement of Iran by England intensified even more. In addition to economic privileges, the company seized a number of political rights. The right to have its own guards and police, schools, etc. The governors of the island of Abadan and other areas where the company's enterprises were located were appointed and removed at the request of the British. The company has become a state within a state. The leading administrative staff of the company, as a rule, consisted of the British military and non-military intelligence officers. Along with the Shahanshah Bank, the Anglo-Persian Oil Company soon became one of the most important levers of British imperialism in Iran. The troops of Tsarist Russia and England, which occupied northern and southern Iran during the suppression of the revolution of 1905 to 1911, never completely evacuated from Iran. On the eve of the war, the troops of Tsarist Russia were in the northern part of Iranian Azerbaijan, occupying the city of Kohi and others. English warships were stationed on the Karen River. English detachments occupied the cities of Avaz and Muhammad, Khorramshahr, in Khuzestan. In the area of activity of the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, the most combat-ready military units in Iran were: in the north, the Karsak brigade of about 8,000 people, headed by Russian officers, and in the south, gendarmerie units, about 7,000 people, under the command of Swedish officers. Thus, by the beginning of the First World War, Iran had almost completely turned into a colony of imperialist powers, and only formally, on paper, continued to be considered an independent state. In 1915, V.I. Lenin wrote about Persia that at that time it was already 9/10 a colony. By 1914, Germany's position in Iran had also grown considerably stronger. In Iran's foreign trade, before the war, Germany already occupied the third place after Tsarist Russia and England. Branches of German firms were opened in a number of Iranian cities. The German steamship line actively developed its activities in the Persian Gulf. Before the war, Germany was already second in maritime traffic in the Persian Gulf after England. Russian-German and especially Anglo-German contradictions in Iran, although they were secondary in comparison with the contradictions between these countries in other parts of the world, nevertheless were an integral part of those imperialist contradictions that led to the First World War. After the start of the war, the Iranian government on November 2, 1914 officially announced the neutrality of Iran. Despite this, its territory turned into an arena of armed struggle between warring imperialist blocs. The initiative for the invasion came from the German-Turkish troops. The plan developed by Enver Pasha together with German officers provided for the capture of the entire Transcaucasus, northern Iran, the Trans-Caspian Russian regions, and Central Asia. The Turks and Germans hoped to use pan-Turkic and pan-Islamic propaganda to draw Iran and Afghanistan into the war against England and Russia. Threatening Russian Transcaucasia, Turkish troops in November 1914 invaded Iranian Azerbaijan and occupied its western regions, the cities of Kohi, Urmia, etc. On November 14, 1915, the Turks occupied Tabriz. In response to these actions of the German-Turkish bloc, at the end of January 1915, Russian troops launched an offensive against Turkish troops in Iranian Azerbaijan. Even before that, new British troops had arrived in the southwestern oil-bearing region of Iran. Military operations began between Russian and Turkish troops on Iranian territory. First, they took place in Azerbaijan, where on January 31, 1915, Russian troops occupied Tabriz, and then in the regions of Hamadan, Kermanshah and Karnakin. At the same time, the Tsarist, British and Turkish generals behaved in the regions of Iran occupied by their troops as absolute masters in the colony, regardless of the Iranian authorities. As a result of the secret negotiations that took place in late 1914, early 1915, between the Russian Minister of Foreign Affairs Sazonov and the British Minister Grey, formalized by an exchange of notes in March 1915, it was decided to divide the neutral zone of Iran. In exchange for England's promise of Constantinople and the Straits of Tsarist Russia, the latter agreed to the annexation of a neutral zone. With the exception of the cities of Isfahan and Yazd and a small territory adjacent to the junction of the Russian, Iranian and Afghan borders, to the English sphere of influence. The British especially sought to annex the southwestern part of Iran to their sphere of influence, where by that time the British Oil Company was intensively developing oil production. The economic and political enslavement of Iran, the occupation of part of its territory by Turkish, British and Tsarist troops. The agreement on the final division of Iran into spheres of influence, all this increased anti-imperialist sentiments in Iran. Even the Iranian government, which consisted of representatives of the feudal elite, took a sharp anti-English position in 1915. And, conversely, Germany, which fought against England and Russia, seemed to many nationalist-minded bourgeois and landlord politicians in Iran a country that could be relied upon in the struggle against England and Tsarist Russia. This made it possible for Germany, which was striving to achieve its imperialist, predatory goals, to take advantage of the anti-British and anti-Tsarist sentiments in Iran. The German mission, the German consuls, as well as Turkish representatives and other German agents, widely launched anti-English and anti-Russian propaganda in Iran. The German representatives succeeded in various ways in attracting many Iranian politicians to Germany's side. The Swedish officers, who led the Iranian gendarmerie, took a clearly Germanophile position, and the Iranian gendarmerie, located in the southern regions of Iran, turned into an instrument of German policy. German agents launched covert activities to organize tribal uprisings, terrorist acts, and other actions against Russian and British representatives and institutions in Iran. The activity of German agents developed especially widely in 1915 in Bandar Bushehr, Shiraz, Kermanshah, Isfahan, Yazd and Kerman. Many of them were the official representatives of Germany in Iran, holding the posts of consuls, vice-consuls, etc. in an effort to use the religious prejudices of the population of Iran. Agents of Germany and Turkey conducted pan-Islamist propaganda, demagogically declaring that all Germans, led by Wilhelm II, converted to Islam. They called the German Kaiser, Haji Wilhelm. It should be noted that both England and Tsarist Russia sought to consolidate their dominant position in Iran not only by force of arms. Through bribery and in other ways, they also tried to create for themselves a support within the country from various elements of the population of Iran. The command of the Tsarist troops in Iran managed to attract some Kurdish tribes to the side of Russia. The Dashnaks, representatives of the feudal aristocracy, and other elements acted as agents of the Russian and British imperialists. Regarding this activity of representatives of the imperialist powers in Iran, V.I. Lenin wrote, "The consuls of all three great powers are conducting shameless intrigues, bribing gangs, inciting a struggle." The successes of the Germans at the end of 1915 in southern Iran were as follows great that in November of this year, with the help of units of the Swedish gendarmerie, they managed to occupy Shiraz, the main city of the province of Fars, and capture the English consul and other Englishmen who were in Shiraz. Fearing to fall into the hands of the Germans, British and Russian representatives and subjects left Isfahan, Yazd, Kerman in 1915 and took refuge in Avav and Bandar Abbas, occupied by the British. Following Shiraz, the Germans established their influence in Kerman and other cities of southeastern Iran. It was no coincidence that they rushed precisely to these regions of Iran. They wanted to gain a foothold on the outskirts of India. For the same purpose, Germany sent a German-Turkish-Austrian military mission through Iran to Afghanistan, headed by von Gentig and Captain Niedermeyer. The mission was tasked with bringing Afghanistan into the war on the side of Germany. The mission reached Kabul not without difficulty. Although some of the Afghan Khans and officers were ready to take the side of Germany, the Afghan Emir Habibullah, who used the war to obtain new subsidies from England, refused to accept the German proposals, and the mission was forced to leave Afghanistan. In the capital of Iran itself, in Tehran, in the first year of the war, German influence was also great. The Democratic Party, which reflected the interests of the Iranian bourgeoisie and opposed England and Tsarist Russia, adhered to the German orientation. Germany managed to win over to its side many deputies of the Third Majlis, who spoke in favor of supporting the German-Austrian-Turkish bloc. In November 1915, Mostufi el-Mamalek's cabinet refused to negotiate with Britain and Russia on Iran's entry into the war against Germany. To the strengthening of German positions in Iran, Tsarist Russia responded back. In May 1915, the Russian corps under the command of General Baratov landed in Anzali, and moving towards Tehran, occupied Kazvin. Under pressure from the Russian and British envoys and under the threat of the Tsarist troops. In November 1915, Ahmed Shah was forced to dismiss the cabinet of Mostofi el-Mamalek and dissolve the Germanophile Mejlis. Part of the deputies of the disbanded Mejlis and the dismissed members of Mostofi el-Mamalek's cabinet, accompanied by the German ambassador and the Turkish attaché, left Tehran and left for the city of Qom. Here they announced the formation of a provisional government, which was called the Provisional National Government. Even before that, the Iranian bourgeoisie and landlords, with the active participation of German agents in Iran, organized the nationalist committees, Revival of the Nation, and Defense of Iranian Independence. Part of the Iranian troops and the gendarmerie, led by Swedish officers, went over to the side of the Provisional National Government and the Renaissance of the Nation Committee. The nationalists, who retired to Qom, in their struggle against the Tsarist and British troops, relied on the Germanophile-minded part of the Iranian bourgeoisie and landowners. They were also partially supported by the urban petty bourgeoisie and artisans, who in various places and in various forms spontaneously rose to fight against the imperialist troops and flocked to the nationalists from different countries of Iran, replenishing their detachments. But the Iranian landlords and the bourgeoisie, fighting some imperialists, entered into an alliance with others, the German imperialists. Out of fear of the masses of the people, They did nothing to organize a real national liberation war against the imperialist occupiers. They did not take any measures to improve the condition of the working masses, and in particular the peasantry, in order to create a strong united front against the imperialists. In addition, even among the Iranian bourgeoisie and landlords themselves, there was neither political nor organizational unity. More often than not, the Iranian bourgeoisie and nationalist-minded landlords were a plaything in the hands of German Turkish agents, objectively facilitating the fulfillment of the predatory plans of German imperialism. When, for example, in the winter of 1915, Turkish troops occupied Kermanshah and then Hamadan, they were assisted in these operations by armed detachments organized by Iranian nationalists. All these circumstances could not but weaken the strength of the nationalists and their influence on the masses. In skirmishes between the Tsarist troops and the detachments of the Kom, Provisional National Government, which took place first on the road from Kazvin to Tehran, and then on the way from Tehran to Kom, the latter were defeated. The Provisional National Government was forced to leave Kom and flee to Kashan. Then part of the Kumar nationalists fled to Hamadan and Kermanshah, joining the German Turkish detachments occupying these cities. In Kermanshah, at the behest of German Turkish agents, a so-called national government was formed from representatives of the Iranian landowners and the bourgeoisie, which included some members of the Kom government. The big feudal lord Nizam Sultan was placed at the head of this national government. But already at the beginning of 1916, the Turkish troops were driven out by the Cossacks from Hamadan. In February 1916, the Tsarist troops occupied Kermanshah, and by April approached the Iranian-Turkish border. Turkish troops, part of the nationalist detachments led by German Turkish officers, many members of the national government, and deputies of the dissolved Majlis fled to Turkish territory. The rest of the nationalist detachments, left without leadership, dispersed throughout the country. Subsequently, when Turkish troops reoccupied Kermanshah and Hamadan in mid-1916, members of the national government and Germanophile members of the Majlis reappeared in western Iran. Such was the case in 1915 to 1916. State of affairs in central and western Iran. In southern Iran, as a result of strong dissatisfaction with feudal and imperialist oppression and the incitement of German agents during the first 2 years of the war, anti-English actions by a number of tribes, Bahalu, Tangistani, etc., continued. The Kashkai tribes also ceased to obey the orders of the authorities. The Bakhtiyars split. The large Bakhtiari Khans, shareholders of the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, continued to support the British, while many smaller Khans were brought over to the side of the Germans. England, concerned about the strengthening of the position of German agents in southern and southeastern Iran, decided to completely occupy these Iranian regions. To this end, in early 1916, the British sent a special military expedition to southern Iran, led by General Percy Sykes. In addition to the main task, to occupy southeastern Iran and eliminate the activities of German agents there, Sykes was also instructed to completely eliminate parts of the Swedish gendarmerie and create new military units in their place, led by British officers. The funds for the maintenance of these new military units were to be released by England. Until March 1917, the Iranian government refused to recognize British rights to organize new military units, but despite this, Sykes, regardless of the opinion of the Iranian government, from the beginning of 1916, set about fulfilling the tasks assigned to him by the British authorities. During 1916, Sykes managed to occupy Mekran, Kerman, Shiraz, Yazd and other cities and regions of southeastern Iran and expelled German agents from there. From the troops sent from India and the military units newly organized in Iran, the so-called Eastern Persian Barrier was created, the main task of which was to establish English rule here, and not let German and Turkish agents into India and Afghanistan in the future. In November 1916, after the British troops occupied Shiraz, the gendarme detachments led by Swedish officers were liquidated in southern Iran. Instead of gendarmerie units, the British organized new military units, numbering about 8,000 people, which were called the Corps of the South Nursed Riflemen. All command posts in this corps were occupied exclusively by British officers. By 1917, many centers of the anti-British movement in southeastern Iran were liquidated by the British. Only the tribes of the Qashqai, the Kamsi and other nomadic tribes continued to cause great concern to the British, refusing to obey them. The most dangerous for the British were the Qashqai tribes, led by the feudal leader Sulat-ed-Dole. Subsequently, in 1918, these tribes revolted against the British. Thus, by 1917, Iran was actually occupied by Tsarist Russia, whose troops occupied the entire north of the country, up to Isfahan, and by England, which occupied the rest of southern Iran with its troops. The power of the Shah and his government was fictitious. In fact, all affairs in Iran were controlled by Tsarist and English envoys and generals. This could not but cause among the Iranian people the growth of indignation against England and Tsarist Russia. The longer the war went on, the more the anti-imperialist struggle of the broad working masses of Iran unfolded. Peasant partisan actions against England and Tsarist Russia, and sometimes also against Iranian feudal lords, took place in almost all regions of Iran. But this movement was especially widespread in the north of Iran in Gilan. Mirza Kuchek Khan, a native of the bourgeois environment, became its head. Mirza Kuchek was not a Khan by his social status or origin. Khan was called Kuchek by his followers, referring to him. Mirza Kuchek's father was a merchant. In his youth, Mirza Kuchek studied at the theological school, and was preparing to become a mullah. He participated in the Iranian Revolution of 1905 to 1911, in particular, in the ranks of the Rasht Fidai. He made a campaign against Tehran in 1909. And also took part in the struggle against Mo'millamita Ed Ali Shah. In the very first years of the war, Kuchek Khan led partisan detachments in Gilan from peasants, the urban poor, and partly the petty bourgeoisie, which were formed to fight the occupying forces of Tsarist Russia and the Shah's authorities. The partisans settled in the area of the city of Fumen in the dense forests of Gilan, where access to the royal and Shah's troops was extremely difficult. They were called foresters, Jengels, from the word Dzengel forest. The main task of the Jenghelians was the struggle for the independence of Iran. They made a vow not to cut their hair until they achieved the national independence of Iran, and therefore they went with long hair. Religious prejudices were also very strong among the Jenghelians. The Jenghelians and their leaders clothed many of their ideas and demands in a religious form. The Jengheli people enjoyed the support of the nationalistically minded part of the Gilan merchants and landlords. Their anti-imperialist actions were also supported by peasants, artisans, and the urban poor. Resht and generally nationalist Gilan merchants supplied Kuchek Khan with money. The surrounding population, and first of all the peasants, provided the Jenghelians with present content. In the very first year of the war, the Kurds, led by Kalu Kurban, who worked as farm laborers for the landowners and entrepreneurs of Gilan, joined the Jenghelians. In 1917 to 1918, under the control and influence of the Jenghelians, in fact, there was not only one Gilan province, but also its neighboring regions. The western part of Mazandaran, the Talashinsky district, and others. Headed by Kuchek Khan. The Unity of Islam Committee was not a revolutionary democratic, but a bourgeois nationalist organization influenced by pan-Islamist ideas. The main points of the program developed by the committee were the struggle under the banner of Islam against imperialism, for the independence of Iran, and in the field of the agrarian question. The slogan of returning to the original, democratic, foundations of Islam. This meant the collection of taxes from the land in the amount of a tenth of the harvest. In fact, this meant an increase in taxes that were levied in favor of the Jenghelians. For the peasants, the Jenghelians practiced only the abolition of small natural duties, leaving the relationship between peasants and landowners unchanged. Moreover, sometimes the fees exacted by the landowners from the peasants even increased. In those cases when the peasants stopped paying the landowner's share of the crop without prior notice. The Jenghelians openly opposed the peasants and suggested that they continue to give the landlords part of the crop in the same amount as before. The Jengelians practiced the capture of large feudal lords, whom they then released for a large ransom. Among the Unity of Islam Committee, there was a very strong group of landowners and merchants, headed by a merchant, the landowner Haji Ahmed Kesmai. The Jengelians waged a partisan struggle against the troops of Tsarist Russia and the Shah's authorities in Gilan. But there were cases when they also opposed large Gilan feudal lords, confiscated their grain and other supplies, announced the abolition of corvée, expelled landowners from estates, etc. So, for example, in 1915, partisans organized a fight against a local large feudal Abduriza Khan Shefti. German and Turkish agents, using demagogic pan-Islamist propaganda, sought to force the Jengelians to serve the interests of the German-Turkish bloc. Communication was established between Kuchek Khan and the Germans. There is evidence that even before the beginning of the movement of the Jengelians, Mirza Kuchek Khan had a meeting in Tehran with the German military attaché. German military instructors, led by von Packen, made their way to the Gilyang forests to the Jengelians, who began to train the Jengelis detachments in military affairs. The Germans supplied Kuchek Khan with weapons. The German officers stayed in the Gilan forests until the middle of 1918. To some extent, they really managed to use the movement of the Jengelians in their own interests. They managed to get Kuchek Khan to send several groups of mujahideen, volunteers, to help the German-Turkish detachments operating near Hamadan, Kermanshah, etc. The Shah government several times sent detachments of Cossacks against the Jengelians. But the partisans, who enjoyed the support of local peasants, successfully repelled their attacks, or dispersed when a large detachment approached, only to reassemble after a while and resume their activities. The economic situation of Iran during the war was very difficult. The rule of the imperialists in Iran, the requisitioning of British, Tsarist and Turkish troops, the devastation as a result of hostilities led to economic ruin. Foreign trade, in particular the export of agricultural products from Iran, has declined sharply. From 1913-14 to 1917-18, the export of dry fruits decreased from 70 million kran to 48 million, cotton from 83 million kran to 24 million, rice from 41 million kran to 20 million. Raw hides, from 20 million cranes to 3 million, etc. The sown area was significantly reduced, and food shortages began to be felt strongly. As a result, in 1917, famine and a typhus epidemic began almost everywhere, with the exception of Gilan and Mazandaran. Bread prices have risen 12 to 15 times, and speculation in grain has taken on an extremely large scale. The British bought food and sent it to Mesopotamia, or created large food stocks. Maneuvering these funds, they raised the price of bread even higher. The population fled from the most devastated areas, and some parts of the country were almost completely depopulated. Iran's finances were in a critical position. Taxes and revenues from customs were not received. In many regions of Iran, especially in the south, many gangs of robbers appeared, which plundered trade caravans and almost completely closed trade routes. The governors of individual provinces often refused to obey the orders of the central Shah's government, whose authority was fictitious. Iran was in such a state when, at the beginning of 1917, the news came of the February bourgeois democratic revolution in Russia. Soldiers' committees began to be created in the Russian troops stationed in Iran. The news of the overthrow of Tsarism in Russia was enthusiastically received by the working people of Iran. The bourgeois provisional government of Russia continued to pursue an imperialist foreign policy. The royal envoy Minusky, General Baratov, and Colonel Bicharakov continued to stay in Iran with their troops. On March 17, 1917, Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Provisional Government Milyukov sent the following telegram to Tehran to Minusky in response to appeals from the Iranian public. We consider it is useful to bring to the attention of the Shah's government that Russia will continue to adhere to full cooperation with England in Persian affairs and Russia's policy will not tolerate any change. Keep in mind, however, that under our new system we cannot openly oppose the liberal trends in Persia. Therefore, it is desirable that in such matters you give the initiative to the English envoy, giving him your support in his undertakings. Millionaire Tereshchenko, who replaced Milyukov as Minister of Foreign Affairs, telegraphed Sky on May 9, 1917. The general direction of our policy in Persia, as indicated by my predecessor, remains on the same basis of full cooperation with England. At the same time, the counter-revolutionary provisional government assured Buchanan, the British ambassador in St. Petersburg, of the inviolability of the joint Anglo-Russian policy in Persia, and that Russia had no reasons to sympathize with the Persian Democrats. After the February Revolution in Russia, the enslavement of Iran by England intensified even more. From August 1916, the well-known Anglophile and reactionary Vosiged Dole was the Prime Minister of Iran. The influence of the British in Tehran also increased enormously in connection with the failures of the Turkish-German troops in western Iran and in Mesopotamia. In relation to the national liberation movement in the country, the government of Vosiged Dole, together with the British, led a policy of cruel reprisals, punitive expeditions, executions, gallows. In response to all this, by April 1917, anarchist elements in central Iran organized the so-called Committee of Retribution Committee Mojazat, which consisted mainly of representatives of the bourgeois intelligentsia. The committee set itself the task of fighting the British and overthrowing the Shah's power. The Committee of Retribution saw the main means of struggle in organizing a conspiracy and in terror against individual representatives of the Anglophiles and reactionaries. The assassination of Ahmed Shah, Vosiged Dole, and others was planned. Members of the committee committed about 10 terrorist acts. In connection with the complication of the situation in the country, Vosiged Dole resigned. But the change of faces did not lead to a change in the policy of the Shah's government. And in this case, the tactics of individual terror turned out to be harmful to the development of the revolutionary movement. The Committee of Retribution lasted only a few months. In the summer of 1917, the day before the planned assassination attempt on Vosiged Dole, the committee was betrayed by a provocateur to the Shah's authorities. Almost all members of the committee were arrested, and the activities of the terrorist center ceased. The members of the committee, who managed to avoid arrest, moved to Mazandaran and Gilan, where they joined the Gengilians. The addition of these anarchist elements subsequently caused great harm to the development of the revolutionary movement in Gilan as well. Thus, on the eve of the Great October Socialist Revolution in Russia, Iran was almost completely subordinated to England.